Not quite sure how that works. How through using the planning system? How do you persuade the existing owner occupiers to?
Well, in the same way as a 106 agreement, you end up forking out to pay for an improvement or additional housing or whatever you pay for your 106. Why aren't you paying just for basic loft insulation for everyone on the street?
Okay, I'm not quite sure how the planners, though, how the planning system pays.
Well, I guess the point I'm saying is, why are we focusing so much
on new build,
putting so much money
Correct.
into improving the energy efficiency of one house on the street, when we could, as part of the planning law, insist on a levy that pays towards improving all the homes on the street, saving a lot more energy per pound.
Okay. Thank you for that. Anyone want to come back on that?
I think it's quite an interesting idea, but just to look at the numbers, which is quite helpful. The cost of putting insulation into a new house may be 500 to 1,000. To do it in an old house, about 10 to 20,000. So there's a huge difference between the two numbers. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but it's just and it is cost efficient to do so. But it is very different. And on the specific thing of the loft insulation, actually most of the lofts are now done. About 70 or 80% are already done. And we're seeing the end of that in the not too distant future. So that's just one of the things which we've sort of got a moderate tick on. It's not thick enough, but it's a moderate tick.
What are the things, John, if lofts are nearly done, or at least halfway done, what are the things, though, that we haven't done and we ought to be getting into fast?
Solid wall insulation. That's the big one at the now. That's the one we've really got to do something about.
Expensive.
It's huge. It's expensive, but it's not, the cost of doing up a house, it sounds a lot of money, 20,000. That's what the private sector people would spend on doing up a bathroom or a kitchen. About that same amount of money. It's a lot of money, but it's not outside the normal range, and the value of the house goes up too. So it's not only got to be, but it's possible. And if you look at these super homes, you'll see people have done it, and they're not rich people. Most of them are not rich people. But they've done it. So it's. I think one of the great things about the super homes is you can go and see them and see that this is not something for the mega rich people. They're council houses as well. It can be done by everybody.
And how do you like the idea of that being paid for by a loan that stays with the property, not with the occupier? Not with the initial occupier?
This is called the pay scheme, and I did a financial report looking at all the different schemes across the world, and that one comes out pretty well. And what I mean by pretty well, it is that one of the key parts is to look at what the multiplier is for every pound that government spends, how much money gets spent on the site. And it turns out that the pay scheme is about, for every pound that you spend, about £5 gets spent on site. That's a good multiplier, it's good leverage. And so figures like 10 to 15 billion pounds a year, which is what we've got to spend, in terms of what you're looking at the government spending, is about 2 billion, if that's so. And if you look at the unemployment benefit to be dealt with, it may come down to 1 billion. And if you look at having to not pay winter fuel allowance, it's cost neutral or even cost negative. So I think yes, that's a good scheme. I would also commend the German scheme, which works very well. Currently they get for every the government spends less than €1 billion a year on this, and they get nearly €6 billion spent on the building side. It's huge. And these numbers are the sort of numbers that we're looking for in the billions, and the Germans have already got it. And I sometimes think that the only reason we're not using the German thing, it's got one big problem. It's got made in Germany on it. And, and I think we might have taken it better if it had been made in some other part of the world. I don't know. But But Pays is not a bad substitute for it.
You threw in there that we need to abolish the winter fuel allowance as well, which is obviously a good idea to prevent the need for the heat rather than pay later for the leaky building. However, I can just see that headline, brown to slash winter fuel allowance for pensioners. Boo. This is not exactly the right moment to put it on the table, but it's absolutely right and sensible.
Some people suspect that this was Gordon Brown's little present to everybody because he was the one who brought it in.
Absolutely. Other points from the floor, please. We can certainly move. Jim, did you have a comment on that on the winter fuel allowance point? Oh, well, we're going to take a point up there first.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. My name's John Tweed. I'm an architect in Chester. I just wanted to give a little observation of what I've taken from today, which is some really encouraging stuff. I've enjoyed a lot of the presentations, but what we're trying to do in Chester is put what John Doggett is talking about, which I'm so pleased to hear him say, which is making this story visible and accessible and understandable to everybody. I've enjoyed listening to all the different stories, and I'm very much engaged in this field, but I have to say that one thing that worries me about our conversations, our multiple conversations about the future of energy and social housing, is that we need to stop using the word innovation and use the word consolidation a bit more. The stories need to be brought together. I'd love to have had a single conversation in which David Ireland said, right, okay, we will look at 10% of the houses that we are trying to get back into use. We'll make sure that the ones that sit in the middle of low income neighborhoods, we make it a priority. We will refurbish them to a good standard. We'll make them open. We'll open them to the neighbourhoods to let people engage and see and feel and touch what's actually going on, so that we can all feel that there is a reasonably consistent way forward. I mean, the difficulty is that it is a very complex market, the retrofit market. It is our biggest challenge. But getting everybody to be comfortable about what we should do next is really quite challenging. I thought that Red or Dead was wonderful, but and the community engagement great. But we do have to do some work to make that to make all the stories we're talking about today actually easy to translate onto streets around the country.
And
Sorry,
seeing is believing.
Seeing is believing all the time.
Absolutely.
Put people in touch with things. Yes.
Right. Yeah. David, would you like to come back?
Yes, thank you, Richard. I found myself sort of returning to the way Ann Power started off this morning, and she was saying one of the problems about housing is that we have more and more demands on what our housing does, and people are unable to afford it, and we create an affordable housing crisis as a result, and have to subsidise housing to ever greater degrees. It just struck me that. It's a fairly new problem, because if you look over human history, actually most of the time humans just build their own houses, and in much of the world they still do. It's only actually in countries like ours, sort of Western countries, in the last few hundred years that we've sort of subcontracted this out to other people. And I have a sort of feeling, that the more we do that, actually, the more problems we create, because we become more and more distant from the houses that we live in. We've subcontracted it all out to other people. And what I was talking about this morning was, I think, ways in which people have got reconnected with their homes, where they've actually done things to them themselves, and where people have been trained up with new skills and enabled them to create the homes that they wanted. Now, if you look at some of those houses, some of the ones that I talked about this morning, some of the ones in Leeds, some of the ones in London, you go around them, and if you were to take a surveyor around them to pick them to pieces, they'd find all sorts of faults, and you may well think that they're not done particularly brilliantly. But the point I felt was that the people who had done them got huge satisfaction out of what they'd done, and a huge sense of pride in what they'd created. And, thinking here, listening to what Wayne was saying about human happiness, and really that's the ultimate goal, is actually that's more important. So I think sometimes we just lay more and more rules on top of our housing, and some of them we need to. The carbon emissions are ones that we've obviously got to get a grip with. But it's another thing on top of all the other rules that we've imposed on our housing, which makes it more and more expensive, more and more distant, and more difficult for people to get hold of.